Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6 of, I think it's 6. I've lost track. I don't know. You recorded a week in advance. It's confusing. I believe it's week 6. We're talking about diversity. Um, Very fun topic, something that I've spent a lot of time in my professional work talking about, thinking about. And I think it'll be a really good conversation today. I'm also going to talk a little bit about your workforce plans. By the time you're watching this, most of you will have turned in at least your first half of your workforce plan, your workforce analysis. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then we'll also talk about our Build a City. We've come up with a name, and we have some basic background that many of you were asking for that we can definitely talk about today. I'm also recording on Super Bowl Sunday, so as a Chiefs fan, it is part of my contract that legally I do have to wear my Chiefs jersey all day on Super Bowl Sunday when we're in the game. So excuse that, and also I completely acknowledge the irony of talking about how important diversity is and equity is when, you know, I'm actively representing an organization that may not be the best at that. So understanding that irony, we're just going to move right ahead here. Let's talk a little bit about the politics of DEI. So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI is often, you may see an A mixed in there where it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. You might see an SJ in and social justice. DEI is this not necessarily a new trend, but it is the popular way that organizations are now talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, access type issues, both in their communities and in the workforce itself. So before we begin, I want to reflect on something that's very silly, but has unfortunately real life consequences for what we're talking about. So Representative from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was in a House hearing not too long ago, talking about the use of the coronavirus relief funds that went to different organizations, particularly government organizations. This entire hearing, I don't expect you to go back and watch it, nor do I want you to, but this entire hearing was essentially an entire political rally against DEI, against the topics of equity and diversity. You know, on top of other, bands of books that talk about these issues, it has become a political sticking point for many in politics to rail against diversity, equity, and inclusion, calling it racist against white people. This is also connected to conversations around critical race theory that is almost always crops up, especially in national politics. But this is really illustrative of the larger problem we have within the public administration space when it talks about DEI, where you have politicians who have politicized and made a political issue out of the terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene even railed against a single elementary school in Illinois that received $5.1 billion as part of their coronavirus relief funds that they used actually for equity and diversity. So $5.1 billion for one elementary school. To put this in context, the entire budget of the Chicago public schools is around $9.1 billion. So this individual elementary school got very lucky in the lottery, and they decided, we're receiving more money than most schools will ever see in their entire existence. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put it exclusively towards equity and diversity. This is silly. This is stupid. It was objectively false. It absolutely not based in reality. However, the politics, the sentiment behind this is something that I actually hear on a daily basis when I'm talking to members of the community. There are certain members of the community that I have been told that when we're talking about things like accessible parks programming and accessible recreation center programming, I've been told that we can't talk about equity and diversity because it is a political issue. This is a really interesting phenomenon and a really interesting challenge, I think, for the field of public management, because we're told we're supposed to be these impartial arbiters or impartial administrators of policy direction that was approved by elected officials. However, more and more you're seeing terms diversity, equity, and inclusion being core values for organizations. How do you square, as an administrator working for an organization that states that they value diversity, they value equity, and they value inclusion, while also being accused of being political? This is something that I want you to really think about, because in SHRM, in HR management at large, DEI is not political. It is an objective reality. It's often aspirational goals that we have to move towards because, as we'll talk about today, diversity, equity, inclusion, access mates for a better workforce. So I just wanted to call out that if anyone's looking for some good equity and diversity training, I'm sure this one Illinois elementary school will be right there for you. So, you know, we talked last week about equal opportunity and laws, regulations that we have to follow. Those are floor policies, right? They set the floor for what the minimum we have to do is. DEI policies, particularly as it talks about diversity and equity goals, are above and beyond. There's not a mandate that you take on DEI, but it is a best practices sort of approach to building a healthier, more equitable workforce. So if you're not familiar with DEI concepts, we're going to go over it a little bit. It might be review for some of you, but I think it's important that we're on the same page about what diversity, equity, and inclusion truly is. So diversity refers to differences in underlying attributes or non-observable differences. Diversity can be both a relatively closed concept where you're talking about racial diversity, you're talking about gender diversity, you're talking about ethnic diversity, you're talking about socioeconomic diversity. But it also can be radically inclusive. A lot of the more small p progressive organizations practice radical diversity, which is its diversity of background, its diversity of perspective, as much as it is diversity of those different protected classes as well. Diversity is something that has to be managed. It has to be something that HR departments are working towards. And to manage diversity successfully, promotion and compensation needs to be determined by performance, initiative, and special skills, and it can't have other intervening factors that are going to prevent people of color, people of diverse backgrounds from moving up and taking leadership roles within the organization. Examples of attempts to manage diversity, well, you know, the New York City Police Department, they've worked really hard towards having a representative and diverse workforce. There's other policies we can talk about with them, not a policing class. The National Park Service, they have specific internships designed to attract new rangers from diverse backgrounds. Colorado State Patrol includes things like sexual orientation and diversity training programs, right? And then, you know, you're looking at the county level. Cuyahoga County in Ohio has healthcare benefits for the children of gay couples. That's something that is not currently required by federal law. And so going above and beyond and really understanding what your community's needs are is a big part of developing these programs. And then Executive Order 13583 requires that federal agencies submit their agency-specific diversity and inclusion strategic plans to the OPM. This is really important because a lot of times you're going to hear things like diversity and inclusion plans as quota type plans. Like, are you meeting your quota? And as we talked about last week, remember, quotas are not legal. Quotas are not what affirmative action or what diversity and inclusion are about. Diversity and inclusion is about setting strategic goals for what you want your workforce to look like going forward. So if you're unfamiliar with the term, we talk about equity in DEI. We don't talk about equality. Equality was kind of our first wave of the professional understanding of DEI type topics. And equality is giving each person equal things regardless of their backgrounds, right? So the easiest way to demonstrate this is all these people, regardless of their height, are given the same box. Equity is the distribution of fairness amongst people. It's to each what they need, right? And so you're seeing here, equity is giving the shortest person the most boxes, and not because everyone needs to have 3 boxes, but because they particularly need those 3 boxes. The difference between equity and equality is really important, particularly when you're talking about outcomes as well, because equality is incredibly easy to quantify. Equality is essentially saying, are we paying everyone equally across the board? Are we giving everyone equal access to things? And equality is a fine thing to talk about, but equity is what really works to change social dynamics and power structures within organizations to lift up people who need the lifting up. Social equity. This is an excellent article. I believe I did assign it. I'll double check. If I didn't, I will be assigning it, by Mary Guy and Sean McCandless. They talk about the difference between equality and equity. Equality is a mathematical measure in which equal parts are identified. The 14th Amendment is an equality measure, right? Equal protection under the law. It does not attribute special protections to people who have been historically discriminated against. It just says everyone must be treated equally. Whereas equity is more flexible, less quantitative, allowing for equivalency while not demanding exactness, right? So affirmative action is a great example of equity programs, because you're not saying, oh, you need to have a equal preference for everyone. You're saying that people of specific backgrounds have been historically discriminated against, and so we are going to take actions to help correct for that inequality using this equity type program. Social equity in practice is a little different, right? It's habit for a decision maker. It's a process that each individual person must go through, but it's also a goal. We can talk about social equity as an internal psychological process that we all have to learn and engage with. But then you can also have social equity as an administrative goal by measuring, are we achieving specific equity outcomes? You can measure it with fairness, with access, with quality, and with outcomes, right? There's different types of social equity that you're going to see in the workforce. You're going to see procedural fairness. This is due process, equal rights. This is ensuring that people are receiving the same treatment regardless of their backgrounds, right? More of an equality type measure, but an important thing to understand, especially if you're working in a sector of public or nonprofit management that is very service delivery heavy, making sure that your services are being delivered with equity and equality in mind. The availability of services and benefits, right? Are you able to offer the benefits that are necessary to each individual group? Providing those services, are we meeting people where they are? Are we giving them access to these resources? And then level of outcomes for all age groups is another way to consider whether or not we're practicing social equity in the workforce. And then the guarantee of opportunities for citizen engagement. This is things like social equity in practice is holding town halls in largely Hispanic, Spanish-speaking communities in Spanish to make sure that they are able to access the community service and the community engagement that traditionally only English-speaking people have been able to access. Federal workforce trends. We talked a little bit about this. I'm just going to skim through this, but you're looking at things like the increase in access for minority employees, the increase in access for female employees. This is not necessarily, what I really want to illustrate here is that it's not necessarily come at the detriment of white employees, right? It's just shown an increase in labor participation. That is even more pronounced when you're looking at female and minority, or female minority in state and local workforce organizations, right? You're looking at a significant spike, obviously much more on the white employees side, but a much sharper spike for minority employees and female employees. There's a couple of different things, a couple of terms that you may come across when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And these are some that you may have heard of, just casually in normal conversation. The glass ceiling is the most popular one. It's the artificial barriers that block the advancement of women and people of color to upper-level management and executive positions within organizations. This is the ability for people of color, the BIPOC community, LGBTQ people, individuals, women to be able to compete on an equal playing field with different individuals. This glass ceiling is easily thought about when you're talking about things like politics, right? The glass ceiling is still completely intact when you're looking at presidents of the United States, right? And then you got the sticky floor, and this is another issue in which women and people of color are who are excellent in their staff positions and lower level managers and not given promotions because of it. And this is pretty easily measured when you're looking at just the historic promotion and advancement of your employees within organizations. Then you have glass walls, where individuals in those staff level, those line level positions find it difficult to move positions that require supervisory responsibility. And so that is that horizontal movement across the organization, right? And then you have the glass elevator, which is what we use to understand the different workplace rewards that men and women receive when they work in predominantly female occupations, right? So this is talking about occupations like nursing or teaching, which are high in female, predominantly female occupations. How men are treated in those environments as compared to traditionally male-dominated environments. This is also important to understand when we're talking about the individual employee experience, right? There's been studies, and it's anecdotal for most women or people of color in the workforce, where there is a level of qualifying, or do you qualify for a position maybe set for a person like me, straight cis white dude, well educated. I might have to just meet minimum requirements to be considered to hire, whereas people of color, women, are instead have to be overqualified to even be considered competitive with someone like me. And so it's important to understand these different dynamics, both at an organizational level and also for our individual employees and people. Diversity is important for a bunch of different reasons, but I'm going to really try to stick empirically here. And let's talk about what diversity does in practice. Research has shown that diversity can improve service effectiveness. It can improve efficiency of your employees. It makes employees more productive. It creates more creative alternatives, right? When you're brainstorming, I work in a job where I do a lot of creative thinking and brainstorming, and the more diverse ideas we get in the room, the better the ideas are. You're talking about higher quality ideas as well. This is the wisdom of the crowd phenomenon, where we get more people involved, you get higher quality outcomes. And then you have different opposing ideas and viewpoints as well. We never want to be in a situation where our workforce is largely in agreement about everything they talk about, right? We want challenging ideas to help us grow and help us prosper. Also, it increases one's understanding of the community and the market writ large, right? Having a more diverse workforce helps your employees understand issues of diversity in their communities for their customers. And then it also increases the quality of team problem solving, right? You have more quality ideas, you have more creative alternatives, you're going to get better problem solving outcomes. Diversity management, to try to get to those outcomes, should include management process that create a supportive environment for people no matter their background, and you're also creating a supportive environment that lifts up people who have been historically included. The first step of any sort of diversity management is understanding their organizational cultures. Surveys, diversity atlases, different things that organizations use to figure out what their organizational culture is as it relates to diversity, and then creating plans to achieve specific outcomes and manage that diversity. This is balancing two goals. That's difficult, right? Where you're getting employees to accept dominant values. You're getting employees to accept that diversity, equity, inclusion is a value of your organization. And you're also getting them to accept that differences are okay. This is a really difficult, it's a big lift for a lot of organizations. But you have to think about, for most individuals, the only time that they're ever going to be exposed to true diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts and training is going to be in the workplace, particularly for public and nonprofit employees. So being able to demonstrate and educate about those values while encouraging a mindset shift is difficult and competing, but a worthy goal that many organizations are pushing towards. We also have to, when we're managing our diversity, recognize and appreciate that individuals are different. They come from diverse backgrounds. Sound like a broken record, but treating our employees as people who happen to be employees rather than employees who happen to be people. people, understanding that they're different and they have their own personalities and backgrounds. They're not, we're not saying, oh, we need to hire more Black employees because all Black employees are the same. It's understanding that all Black employees may have similar experiences, they may express that, but they're individual people and we have to be able to respond to that. Diversity, if it's well managed, can be an advantage for your organization. It's something that can be a pitch. It can help you attract new talent. It can help you attract positive press and positive PR. It can help you grow your organization. The City and County of Boulder here in Colorado does an excellent job with managing and promoting their diversity. And honestly, diversity should be encouraged, right? Diversity, unlike what Marjorie Taylor Greene wants you to believe, is something that is a positive outcome. It's something that, if you're looking at a social emotional lens, it's a positive outcome, or if you're looking at pure management outcomes, it's positive. And so diversity is something that should be encouraged. When we're talking about managing diversity in the strategic human resource management program, it's understanding that you're doing everything for both promoting these goals while also lifting up current employees to help them understand those strategic diversity goals as well. So incumbent employees already there, may have either conscious or unconscious biases that will keep them from accepting new or different employees. Educating them is an important part of managing diversity in a strategic way. Training management and employees to accept diversity is essential. It's important, but it's not enough. I like to talk about my city, Commerce City, as an organization that has gotten through this first wave. We have gotten to a point where we all acknowledge that racism exists, right? You're getting past those initial barriers to accepting that people have different outcomes and that white privilege exists and these different concepts. That's cool, but it's not going to actually help you achieve those specific diversity outcomes you're looking for. You have to be strategic with how you're educating employees beyond just the basic knowledge of what diversity means. And then at agency levels, policies and practices have to be institutionalized into the culture as the first step. You cannot policy make around diversity and get people to accept it without working to change their hearts and minds first, right? You have to make sure that we're building diversity, you're building these themes, these values into your workplace culture before we even start to think about what strategic policy steps we can take. This is the City of Portland's Office of Equity and Human Rights. They have equity goals and strategies. This is a perfect example of strategic diversity human resource management, right? We're talking about goals: ending racial disparities within the city government, strengthen outreach, public engagement, and access to city services for communities of colors, and immigrant and refugee communities. And then collaborating with the community and institutions to eliminate racial inequity in areas of government, including education, criminal justice, environmental justice, health, housing, transportation, economic access, right? This is a really important thing to talk about when we're talking about strategic management, because these goals are goals that are measurable, they're specific, they are aspirational and realistic, and because of the way that the different communities set up their strategic goals, there is a time-bound component, those SMART goals that we talk about when we're talking about strategic planning. And then they create strategies underneath that help support and achieve those goals. A racial equity framework, building organizational capacity, implementing a racial equity lens, being data-driven in the work we do, partner with institutions and communities, and operate with urgency and accountability. These are different things that it's important to talk about that organizations have been thinking about for a long time, and how do we achieve those? Unfortunately, a lot of organizations are just now coming around to accepting the need for this sort of thought pattern and this sort of strategic goal. Thanks to the Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests of 2020, that saw a spike in these type of programs and initiatives around the country. You can also talk about diversity when you're talking about liability. Remember, liability is an important thing when we're talking about human resources. Liability, making sure or staying in compliance with EEO laws, you're staying in compliance with state laws, you're minimizing your liability when it comes to different things, particularly with sexual harassment, right? An employer is likely to minimize its sexual harassment liability under the following circumstances. So this is using those strategic outcomes that we want to see from diversity to help actually minimize our liability when it comes to sexual harassment claims. Do we have an anti-sexual harassment policy that's explicit and people have access to? Do we have a sexual harassment complaint procedure? What does that procedure look like? Is that procedure built in a way that considers diversity, equity, and inclusion? Educate supervisors, employees as to the actions and behaviors that constitute sexual harassment, right? This is that education necessary but not sufficient component. A culture of zero tolerance. Do people feel comfortable reporting instances of sexual harassment? Prompt and thorough investigation. Are the investigations fair? Are they happening quickly? And are they taking both the victim and the accused employees' perspectives and doing a fair and prompt investigation? And then, are you taking corrective action? By taking these steps, you're doing two things. You're minimizing your organization's liability when it comes to claims of sexual harassment. You're also creating a better sexual harassment policy that helps achieve those strategic outcomes by creating a culture of zero tolerance, by educating employees. You're educating and lifting up two birds with one stone. I'm once again going to skip the video in the lecture. Please go and read this. Lorenzo here talks about how diversity actually impacts individual teams. We're talking about those business goals, right? And so Ms. Lorenzo does a really good job of outlining those specific benefits that diversity can actually do for your organizations and your teams. Diversity as a strategy is something that a group like IBM has used as well. You can discover differences between demographic groups and identities and find ways to appeal to broader sets of employees and customers. So because of these type of strategies, IBM has seen a worldwide increase in female executives by 370%. Ethnic minority executives born in the United States has increased by 233%. 52% of IBM's worldwide management council is composed of women, people of color born in the United States, and non-U.S. citizens to really build that perspective. The organization has seen a number of self-identified LGBTQ plus executives increase by 733%, and then the number of executives with disabilities has more than tripled. Now, these are obviously going to be corporate wash data. It's important to understand that. However, what this is meant to illustrate is that when organizations take diversity seriously as a strategy and a strategic outcome, you can really have a major impact on what your organization looks like and the impact it has on your customers. Within the private sector, the reason why diversity became so successful is that groups like IBM, organizations like IBM, make diversity a market issue. It's understanding the diversity of your markets, which are diverse, multicultural, so that the services and goods you're providing are matching what your market is actually demanding. This is I would argue, just part of the story, but it's an important argument to get people over some of these first hurdles around accepting diversity as a strategic goal, right? For IBM, diversity was linked directly to their customers and their profit. They created task forces made up of executives and people who met different demographic identities. They also had a sponsor who reported to their diversity team and HR, and each of these task force worked on their top diversity concerns. These concerns included professional development and promotion. We're talking about that glass elevator, glass wall, glass ceiling topic, right? Senior management communication of its commitment to diversity. This is really important. Diversity programs are successful when grown from the ground up, but supported from the top down. Recruitment, are you recruiting from diverse resources? Are you drawing on diverse talent pools? Domestic partner benefits. This is something that was a huge thing before the Supreme Court case, Obergefell v. Hodges, that legalized same-sex marriage across the country. That there are many states that, up until that point, and still some to this day, that make it difficult for domestic partners or same-sex couples to receive health benefits as heterosexual couples would. Accessibility to buildings. This is ADA and beyond, right? Are we creating accessible physical spaces for our customers and our residents to use? Are our doors wide enough for wheelchairs? Do we have Braille alternatives for reading different resources you may have? Are you providing translators at different locations? And then work and family considerations, just understand, the impact that diversity has on people on an individual and personal level as well. Now, like I said, the private sector has been around and has been fighting, has been pushing towards this diversity as a strategic outcome for a while. But it's also important to know that diverse teams have been studied and shown to be smarter and better at their jobs than non-diverse teams. So the Harvard Business Review talked about a 2015 McKinsey report on 366 public companies and found that those in the top quartile for ethnic and racial diversity in management were 35% more likely to have financial returns above the industry mean. And those in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have returns on industry mean. What this creates is an environment in which you can talk about diversity in a business way, focusing on facts, remaining objective, saying that diverse teams lead to better business outcomes. They process facts more carefully. Diverse teams are going to bring more perspectives. They're going to be more thoughtful about the conversations and the ideas that they're promoting, and they're also more innovative. They're going back to the creative thinking. Drawing on diverse backgrounds leads to better creative outcomes as well. So when you're talking about diversity resources, what I want you to think about is actually putting this into practice. These different factors, these different parts of SHRM that we're talking about. Diversity is only part, but it's also all encompassing at the same time. So hiring is just the start for diversity. This is the first thing that many people will think about with diversity. You're talking about affirmative action. You're talking about those sort of concepts. So James Collins, the chair of the Delaware Governor's Council on Equal Opportunity Employment, reflected on diversity resources in organizations by saying, "This is just my view, but diversity in and of itself can breed conflict. So when you bring people together, people from different backgrounds and perspectives, the inclusion part is very important as well. This is about making sure everyone has a seat at the table and also making sure that everyone's voice is heard around the table as well." So what I want you to reflect on as we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion is what are some ways in which organizations can cultivate diversity and inclusion in their workforce? How do you actually get to this point where it's embedded in your workplace culture? And again, the irony of wearing a Kansas City Chiefs jersey while doing my diversity and inclusion lecture is not lost on me. I would happily support the team rebranding at any point. It's just new swag for me to buy, so I'm okay with that. Diversity resources, just some additional things for how you can cultivate this diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Simple things you can do, like converting all job descriptions to gender-neutral language, getting rid of gender-coded words. I just had something corrected that I didn't even realize the other day, as I had a document I was handing out that was talking about measuring manpower, and someone pointed out to me that's gendered language that I should remove when we talk about employee capacity instead, right? Conducting blind screening, blind hiring is one of the most popular trends, right? To minimize unconscious biases. That's both making sure pictures are removed and also any sort of personally identifiable information that would allow people's unconscious biases to start applying racialized thought patterns to these different candidates before you even consider their qualifications. Banning culture fit. Culture fit is Someone in one of their discussions a couple weeks ago talked about, how hiring has to include things like fit within the organization. And I think that that's a fair comment. I completely agree. But considering, how you're trying to reach those diversity outcomes, the concept of culture fit has been used for a long time to exclude people of color, people of diverse backgrounds. And so, can you either ban culture fit, or can you create a culture fit in which the culture is diverse, it's equitable, it is inclusive, and that is the culture that you're trying to fit to, as opposed to the opposite. Explicitly requesting a diverse range of referrals beyond your 3 best friends, right? Are you exposed to a professional group that is diverse in background and diverse in culture? Results-based job descriptions, getting rid of skills checklists can help minimize the institutional barriers to things like education that people of color, women, people of non-American that were not born here, non-natives. It can help improve diversity in your workforce. Start a guys jar. This is something I'm terrible at. I still haven't gotten rid of this. To get rid of that gendered language in the workforce. Or in your workplace, right? Saying guys too much. I do that constantly, and it's something that I'm working on, and it's a hard transition for me. And then invest in a structured interviewing process and training that gets rid of the gut feeling type concept, because that is often guided by our unconscious biases. But great other ideas to talk about here. Some of them are going to work for some organizations and some aren't. When we're trying to actually figure out what our goals are when it comes to diversity, you can consider something like hiring goals, right? Do we understand deep diversity? That's that radical diversity, the diversity of perspectives and cultures. Are we measuring our success? Are we hiring at a different clip? Are we hiring in different cultural and economic and racial ethnic backgrounds? Being transparent, asking for help, educating yourself and your team about diversity hiring, promoting diverse leaders, and treating people like people, not employees. And then finally, the last thing, to bring it back to PA theory, right? Representative bureaucracy is what a lot of PA theory scholars, practitioners are going to talk about why diversity is important. Representative bureaucracy is the idea that under certain conditions, bureaucrats who match the identities of the individuals they serve are more likely to make decisions that benefit those individuals, right? So this is saying if you have a community that is has a large concentration of monolingual Spanish speakers, you want an equal concentration of monolingual Spanish speakers in the workforce as well. And this is easier said than done, because finding people of those backgrounds is, first, A, hard to measure, and B, are you limiting your talent pool? Are you making hiring harder, right? But representative bureaucracy is something that has been, it's still talked about, it's still definitely a theory level conversation, but it does have empirical data to suggest that representative bureaucracy improves equity outcomes as well. So our current personnel systems must be reviewed to recruit and retain a diverse workforce. We know that a diverse workforce can lead to better ideas because those different individuals are likely to perceive problems in different ways and develop alternatives that are more creative, right? Successful management of diversity leads to better interpersonal communication among employees, responsiveness to social and demographic changes, a reduction in equal employment litigation, right? And a climate of fairness and equity. On the flip side of that coin, hostile work environments that may not be receptive to diverse employees and diversity concepts can increase turnover rates and actually make your job harder. And then workforces that are representative of their constituents may also be successful in expanding their constituent and customer base and poised to capture new markets. So there's both a personal benefit to DEI as well as a business argument at the same time. that is what I have on DEI today. I do want to talk a little bit about our workforce plans. I want to talk a little bit about writing in general as we actually start to dive into some of the heavier writing topics, and I'm going to talk about our city as well. So, for workforce plan and analysis, I'm recording this in advance, but by this point I will have read and reviewed and left comments on your first major deliverable for your workforce plan. And there's a couple of things I want you to think in mind when you're really considering what the purpose of this plan is, what the purpose of your analysis is. So for your given entity, what are the expected program changes over the next 1 or 3 years, and what will drive those changes? If you're working with an entire organization, what are organization-wide changes that are anticipated within the next 3 years? If you're working with individual teams, departments, or divisions, what are those? What are they doing that's going to change over the next 1 to 3 years, and what's going to drive those changes? Also talk about short-term and long-term plans and strategies. This goes beyond short-term and long-term plans for just overall strategic planning initiatives, but also for your workforce development, for specific outcomes. Are there plans that have been put in place that you can base your research off of, or does your organization not have something to that effect and needs to develop something? What are the specific workforce challenges in the organization? So I know one of you is working for a smaller mountain community that you'll be completing this project for, and one of the workforce challenges that we spoke about in our meeting was that there is not a large talent pool to draw on in small mountain communities. You have to really expand where you're advertising, where you're drawing from to increase that supply of potential candidates. And then what challenges exist in the emerging market, economic, and political environment. So this is really important. This is where the nuance and the importance of these plans really comes out, because you're not just talking about market changes and economic changes. You're not talking about the increase in fourth wave employment and the decrease in primary employment in a lot of more urban communities. But you're also talking about the political environment, right? Is the political environment that is something that is going to be more receptive to outsiders coming into the organization? As someone who moved to a community out east after graduating, there was a community culture that was less accepting of people who were not originally from that community, right? And so understanding those different challenges is really important to call out, and it's important to the perspectives of your stakeholders, either your contact within the organization or other people within the community, that you can really start to understand those concepts. So you will have a good chunk of your research done by this point that you're watching this, but I do want you to really strongly consider what is the outcome, what is the purpose, what are those larger questions that you're trying to answer with our workforce plan. Here's my writing tip. Passive voice. I talked about this at the very beginning of the class. I'm going to talk about it again. Passive voice is some of the most frustrating stuff to read that you're ever going to read, both in the workforce and in school, right? Passive voice produces a sentence in which the subject receives an action, as opposed to active voice, in which the subject performs the action. Passive voice, the easiest way to understand is it gets rid of accountability. It obscures and obfuscates who's responsible for creating what in a sentence. It also creates longer, less direct sentences that I think are harder to understand and more likely to increase confusion. So, for example, arms were seized by British soldiers, right? So this is talking about our subject receiving these arms, as opposed to the active voice in which British soldiers seized arms. This both creates accountability in saying that the British soldiers did this thing that achieved this outcome, but is also much more direct, where you're saying, like, okay, British soldiers seized those arms, as opposed to, oh, so the arms were seized. A lot of times, the easiest way to think about it is that removing those be verbs. Be verbs will contribute to passive voice in your writing. And so instead of were seized, in which the verb is were, a variant of a be verb, seized is the verb in the active voice. And so this is a really important thing to consider. And if you really want to bring your, both in academic work and in the professional world, if you really want to bring your writing to the next level, really focusing on eliminating that passive voice and replacing it with active voice is really important. When you kind of hit that next level, you can start to strategically use passive voice in situations in which you want to obfuscate the direct cause, in which in the narrative or the argument that you're telling, sometimes that you can use that strategically to achieve better understanding for your readers. But the first step is removing passive voice from your writing altogether. All right. Let's talk about our city. So we had a couple of different suggestions. I've been using Creek Ridge. That's my default Colorado city name, but we are actually the city of Eagle Bend, Colorado. I love this one. Here's a wonderful picture that was definitely not created using AI generated art. So let's talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I received questions about what are the population dynamics, what are the economic dynamics, and so I want to talk a little bit about the political details of our city that we're creating, and then I also want to talk about the economic and workforce issues that we're seeing as well. So within Eagle Bend, it is the seat of Niwot County, which replaced Eagle County after a tragic skiing accident destroyed the county courthouse. It was terrible. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but it did make people of Eagle County really reconsider what they want to do. It is a town manager's council form of government, right? So our town has a chief administrative officer that is merit-based and a council that is directing the policy. And then here are the community priorities for services. So we're only focusing on their two top priorities, which are public safety and public works. But the other priorities for the community include neighborhood services, which is our planning and code enforcement, right? Making sure that our growth is managed and is smart. And then sustainability services. It's a community near the mountains, and so it's important to those residents that they preserve natural spaces, parks, and provide environmental services that can help promote specific environmental outcomes within the community. It's something that's politically important to many people. Let's talk about the population. So here's a graph of the population change within Eagle Bend itself over the past 24 years. From 1994 to 2017, we saw a massive increase in millennials, and millennials became the largest population participating in the Eagle Bend workforce. You're also seeing from 2017 on, the largest workforce growth was post-millennials, growing from that 5% measure. So this is our Gen Xers, and eventually Gen Alpha, I believe is what the next group is called. But they're growing from 5% to 11% of the workforce today. And then boomers shrunk in the workforce in Eagle Bend from 25% to 19%. So you can see that direct trade-off where we're seeing younger people joining the workforce in Eagle Bend, while older people are aging out. Those are the sort of trends that we're seeing. And then economic details. I'm going to break this down by supersectors. Supersectors is how the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, talks about economic development. But within Eagle Bend, leisure and hospitality is a majority of the economy that's there. Particularly its brewing economy. So this is Uncanny Brewing, a large brewing company located in Old Town Eagle Bend. This is also something that was definitely not generated using AI art, and that is why it's called Uncanny Brewing. Don't look too closely at it. Anyway, education, health services, 21%. So that's local education, schools, and also health services, community health centers. The city does not have its own hospital, but it does have doctor's offices that operate. Professional and business services, so these are just basic professional services. Financial activities, banking, investing, trade, transportation, utilities, and then, I have education and health on there twice. That's not supposed to be education. Education and health is not supposed to be there at the bottom. That's supposed to be government work. So that's your local government, your state government, and county government employees. I will fix that before I post this. The average median household makes about 4% above Colorado median income for similar households. So I'm not going to say it's a super well-off community, but it's obviously more affluent than the average community in Colorado. And like I said, some major economic features: Uncanny Brewing Company, right here. Again, don't look at it too closely; it's going to start to weird you out as it's done with me. Easy access to nearby ski towns. You're about a 30-minute drive from places like Winter Park, an hour drive from places like Vail, and so you're close, and you're getting a lot of people passing through Eagle Bend on the way to these ski towns. And then the community tends to prioritize walkability and bike usage. It's a smaller community, but it's also a pretty young community, and so things like Uncanny Brewing are incredibly bike friendly. The roads in our old town are incredibly walkable and bike friendly, and so those are the sort of trends that you're seeing within Eagle Bend. When we start working on this, you've all been assigned your different sectors, so please feel free to continue to ask questions, or really just play with, if you're focusing on our recruiting, hiring, and onboarding, if that's your section of the Build a City project, really be thinking about what are the specific challenges of our community, and is there any more information that we need to really help develop out our DPS and DPW services within the city. So that is the class for today. I want to thank you all for your time with me today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I want to compliment you all for your discussion posts. I've seen a lot of really great discussion and really good use of our resources. Keep it up. I think that we're really engaging with the topics in HR really heavily and in critical ways that's going to really help us develop as managers going forward. So thank you all. We will talk